Good afternoon. It is 1:30 on October 2nd, and we are the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee. We have with us the Department of Housing and Community Affairs to talk about troubled properties. We have had a number of conversations since the inclusion of the troubled properties law several years ago, and how that is working, the data that we have, what we're doing with the data, how inspections are working, whether or not these issues are being remediated in the way that we hope to make sure that we have housing that is safe and dignified for everybody in our community. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the department to give us an overview of the Troubled Properties Program, and then we're going to go through a series of questions that the committee had asked the department to answer in advance, and I think the anticipation is that we'll go through those questions one by one, and we will see if there are any questions on the questions and the answers as we take them up on a case-by-case basis. So if there's nothing else to add from council staff, appreciate council staff and the department working together to prepare for the meeting, and I'll turn it over to you, Director Bruton, to give us an overview and then to get into the questions.
Thank you very much, Council Vice President Friedson and Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez. Thank you very much for inviting us here today to talk about the Troubled Properties Program and any other questions you may have. For the record, I am Scott Bruton. I'm the Director of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, and I'm going to turn it over right away to Nathan Bovell, who is our Division Chief for Community Development, which oversees code enforcement and the Troubled Properties Program. And Nathan can give you an overview of the Troubled Properties Program.
And again, good afternoon, President Friesen and Vice President Fanny Gonzalez. Happy to be here today. I am the Chief of the Community Development Division in the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. We would normally be joined with Tamala Robinson, who is the Manager of Code Enforcement, but unfortunately she is ill and is unable to be here. But I did want to recognize that we do have seated in the audience Ms. Kashamba Williams, who is the supervisor for the multifamily division, along with two of our brand new inspectors who are in training, who we invited here just to kind of see how this process works and have a better understanding of how the legislation process goes through it in Montgomery County. So we
welcome. First of all, we hope Ms. Robinson feels better. So we'll send her that and welcome. We're glad you're here, and welcome to the county. We need you, and we're happy to have you. So with that, continue.
Yeah. We were here, I think, back in March, and we had a PHP committee hearing about troubled properties then. There were lots of questions, lots of recommendations. And you know, we took those very well and tried to address as many of those as possible. And some of them are in the answers to these questions, and some of them are actually in the report itself. One of the discussion points was that we wanted to make this report more readily available to the general public. In doing so, we thought it would be very prudent to revamp how the report actually reads in this structure. So we tried to include much more detail in the report. We included some background and the history about how the troubled properties came into place. We also tried to talk a little bit more about the process in terms of our inspection and what happens after an inspection. And then there were some very required points that we talked about that we are required to put in the report, like the list of the properties to be inspected, the list of all the troubled properties, information on housing code violations, and 311. We also included in there, that's brand new in this report, a pie chart that talks about the percentages of properties and units that fall into the troubled status. We thought it was very prudent to do that because when you look at these reports and you see the number of properties that are on the reports, it gives the impression that we have a large amount of blighted units in Montgomery County, which is not actually the case. There are 77 properties that were identified as troubled this year. Of those 77 properties, actually most of them are smaller properties. Of the 77 Only 15 of them are in units that are 100 units or less, and properties that are 100 units or less. 47 of them are in properties that are 20 units or less, which leaves 15 properties that are in the 19 to 99 unit category. So for the troubled property program, that was initially established in Bill 1915, where the county required that the agency go through, do a surge of property inspections of properties, of the nearly 700 properties in Montgomery County, and put those into categories that would be troubled, at risk, or compliant. They fell into categories based on a specific score that they received. There are two general scores, the TV score, which is the total violation score, and the SV score, which is the severity of the violation score. That goes into an algorithm based on the number of units, the space of the common areas, and it determines whether the property is deemed troubled, at risk, or compliant. For properties that are deemed as troubled, they're inspected every year, with 100% of those properties being inspected annually. For properties that are designated as at risk, they're inspected at least every 2 years, and we do a minimum of 25% of those properties as well. However, often we have this discretion to do them more frequently or to add a higher percentage of the properties, which we often do. There were several properties this year that were at risk, but we treated them as if they were troubled and inspected 100% of the units because they barely met the threshold for being designated as at risk. For properties that are designated as compliant, we inspect them every 3 years, and we inspect 25% of those properties. So it's nice to see that the preponderance of the properties fall into the compliant category. Any questions so far? The next point you wanted, after an overview of the report, we are planning to publish this report on our website once we get clearance of that through the county exec. And that's one of the reasons why we put so many more criteria, definitions, explanations, charts into this property. And that way, if anyone wants to take a look at where their property stands, it will be a lot easier for them to access that on DHCA's website, rather than having to look through Data Montgomery, which can be a little bit cumbersome for the layperson to navigate.
Yeah, appreciate that. What's the timing on when this will be published? You said you were awaiting the county executive's review.
It should be within the next week. We've been working with our IT folks to draft up a web page on our website that'll have the current as well as the previous troubled property reports.
Okay, so within a week, you think?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, please send us notification of when that's public so we can take a look. I think it's going to be very important for this to be public. Part of the goal of this program was the public nature of it, for people to know where they stand, for residents to know where properties stand. That is a big part of this, is those buildings that are perpetually not in compliance, that consumers be aware of that. And that's important, and for that to be some of the motivation and incentive to remediate the issues. So, it's only as good as the publicity that it receives. And I don't just mean news stories, but just an easily accessible place where the information will be housed. How often will it be updated? Will that website be updated annually based on the inspections? If you're doing more frequent inspections, will it be updated as soon as those inspections happen? What's your anticipation there?
As anticipated right now, it'll be updated annually to post the reports. But in relation to the rent stabilization law and the restrictions on increasing rents on units in troubled or at-risk properties, we are, as part of our development of regulations, looking at how we can. The current troubled property law allows the director to remove troubled properties off the troubled property list at their discretion if they've complied with the law. And so we're working with the county attorney's office to understand the ins and outs of that and incorporate that into the rent stabilization regulations so that if a property owner is placed into the troubled property category, that they're able to, if they remedy the housing code violations, that they're able to be removed from the troubled properties list so that they don't have restrictions on increasing their rents for an entire year.
So the list would have to be updated more frequently if that discretion is going to be utilized.
Right. Ideally, what we would like to develop is that we would still post the annual reports, just so that that information is available, but that we could develop a dynamic list on our website that would change as the status of the properties change.
Well, I would strongly encourage that. I mean, I think the report is the report. It's a static, evergreen report, that was issued for the year, et cetera, and that shouldn't be changed once the report is issued, unless there's a problem that needs to be edited and fixed. That is the report. But if there's new information that changes the list, I mean, that's what we want. We want problems to be remedied, and we want housing to be safe and dignified. So I get back to us on what the plan is once you come up with that, if you could. But I think that's going to be very important. The last question that I have about this is related in terms of the inspections. How do you feel about your capacity to follow up on the inspections? If your discretion is based on the issues being remedied, it presupposes that you have adequate inspectors to go out and confirm that they've been remedied on a basis that is more frequent than annual. So do you feel like you have that capacity currently? Do you feel like you'll be able to use that discretion, or what is your view on that at this point?
I think that the way for troubled properties, Director Bruton would have the ability to remove them after they have complied with their all the qualifications come off the report. So they have to submit the corrective action plan. They have to have abated all of the violations that were identified during that plan, and they're subject for us to review some of their practices and policies and open work orders. On the troubled properties, it won't actually significantly affect our ability to inspect. But what Director Bruton spoke about, the troubled properties also applies to the at-risk properties under the rent stabilization bill, and that's where it would increase the load of inspections for our inspectors. Right now, we just inspect at-risk properties every 2 years. But if properties at risk and they're subject to the rent restrictions of the rent increases because of the rent stabilization bill, it's going to be their desire to not have to wait 2 years for another inspection. So we will have to start inspecting the at-risk properties, possibly at a more frequent basis than we currently do now, and that's where it could possibly cause a strain on the existing staff. We've gone through calculations as to how many inspections inspectors can do per year. And right now that's about 1,200 inspections per year per inspector. So we would have to take a look at staffing as a result of the rent stabilization bill.
And part of that is figuring out with the regulations what would be required for an at-risk property to be taken off the list. Would it be that they have remediated housing code violations to the level that they would not be considered to be on the list, or would it be required to do a more comprehensive inspection? And so we're going to be working on figuring that out over the next few weeks. We want to make this obviously as little burdensome to the landlords as possible, but at the same time make sure that they are significantly incentivized as per the law passed to remedy the code violations.
Yeah, appreciate that. Well, keep us posted if you would. I think the question that I have here is if this all works as we intend it to, which is to have a list that demonstrates that there is an ongoing problem, to have that serve as an incentive to actually solve the problem so that it leads to safer and more dignified housing for the people who are relying on it, it would require somebody to fix it and then to be able to call the department and say, I fixed it, please send somebody out to inspect it to confirm what I have just told you.
Yeah, we actually already have a process for that. So when the initial inspection takes place, The property receives a list of all of the violations, and then we let them know when we're coming back for reinspection. So there's scheduled re-inspections that we go to make sure that all of those violations are cleared.
And so your question is whether or not adding the at-risk to that same schedule will put a burden on your resources, and you're going to have to assess that. I'm just trying to reconcile the point that you made earlier of whether or not you're going to have the ability to do it. Because what we don't want to have happen is to not have an ability for the department to respond, and so that results in a property owner not bothering to remedy because they don't believe that they're going to get inspected within a reasonable time frame. What we want is this to move somebody to remedy, then them to be able to quickly say, hey, I've remedied this, please come back as soon as possible to remove me from the list. If we don't have the ability to respond quickly to the request for the inspection, the incentive that we're trying to achieve is watered down to the point where it's not as effective. And so, as you heard from the previous, conversation that, precipitated this conversation, that's a real area that we want to focus on. And so I know you're working on it, but we want to make sure that is the case. You're confident about it. And if there are additional inspectors or resources that are necessary, then we want to hear about it. We want to hear about it before the budget, not during or after the budget, because, it's something that we care about. So
absolutely. I'll say, just maybe put what Nathan said in a slightly different way. If we determine that we are able to remove at-risk properties from the list based on our current compliance regime, so notice a violation and then we go back and reinspect and confirm compliance, if we're able to take them off the list based on our current inspection regime, then there won't be any extra cost. It would only be if we determine that we have to do some type of extra inspection to remove them from the at-risk list, and we are hoping that's not true. But we can't give a definitive answer yet.
Sure.
But we do promise that if we do require any additional staffing, we will make sure to let the county executive and you all know as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and just to make it clear, that's because the regulations and the executive regulation and the bill reference what needs to be done to remove a troubled property, but it's silent on at-risk properties, removing them from the list.
Got it. Okay. Let me turn to colleagues. I'll first turn to Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez and then to Councilmember Tremont.
Thank you so much for being here. And by the way, I loved your report. I love the question and answer, the way that you formatted it, because it was very straightforward. So thank you for that. But I would say two things. Since you mentioned it, on the rent stabilization bill that we just passed, when are you going to be coming back with the regulations? Because that's tied in with everything that we're talking about. And as well, I know you submitted supplemental, but it's being worked on. We talked about it as a council recently. So that supplemental that you submitted that hasn't been reviewed yet by the county council include the software and anything else that you need to solve this issue? That's already part of it, right?
Yes, it includes
staffing,
hardware, as well, startup costs,
Okay.
staffing and startup costs.
Okay, so that's taken care of, and then the software that you're gonna be working on will include, because one of the question 21 on the report about what is the most common source of violation where fines are given, you're gonna have a way to identify those, right, in this new software that you're gonna be having, because the lack of information, it's crazy. We don't know what people are doing. So that's part of it, right?
Sure, yes, part of what we're actually planning on saving on labor costs by having the back-end database and portal trigger certain compliance issues.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, already in law, if you have a housing code violation or you're unlicensed, you can't increase your rent.
Right.
But then now with the troubled property at risk, what we're doing is we're working with TEBS, and they're going to be providing the labor to do this.
Oh, that's perfect.
That we're going to merge our code enforcement and licensing databases and then merge the record keeping and compliance functionality that we need for rent stabilization. And we will have one common portal for landlords and tenants. Tenants will just be able to look up information. Landlords will be able to log in, pay their licensing, and register their increased rents.
But that will, following up with a question from Chair Fritzen, let's say you have a trouble property, would it be, I don't want to see like a document like the annual report, because then you fixed the issue and let's say the report was 3 months ago and it's already fixed. If you look at the website, it's gonna look like I haven't fixed anything. Would it be live? Like if I'm a landlord, I make a change into my property, I fix the issue, would the next day, if you look at the website, would it show that I have a problem, or would it be clear? Because that
So what would happen, so right now on our eProperty 2.0 database, you're able to look up and see code, status of code violations, and we will be incorporating that. And so we'll also have a dynamic labeling of troubled or at-risk properties, and then that goal I said of like the web page showing the dynamic list,
Right.
that'll be connected to the back end where properties are labeled, and as a property becomes labeled as troubled or at risk, or that label is removed, that'll be removed in the individual record, and it'll be removed from the list.
Like right
We're
away.
trying to integrate things to improve efficiencies and transparency of
and
information.
transparency. Beautiful. And then the last question, when I joined the county council, one of the first issues that I worked on was a particular trouble property. It was a building in Twinbrook. It was all over the press, and I know I worked closely with inspectors and with Ms. Robinson. You guys had to come back and forth to that particular property, but the issue was that the inspectors will come in and they will work on the issue with the property manager, and then they will say that issue is clear, but then I will hear back from the residents telling me that the issue had actually not been resolved. So that back and forth. So when do you actually determine that the issue, like in this case, was mice in the unit, right? Do you have a way to, like as part of your inspection process, of following up with the residents maybe a few days afterwards to really make sure that the property is cleared and not just hear it from the property manager or the owner?
Well, typically when we're dealing with infestations, there are several ways that we determine if a property has cleared that violation. One is by taking a review of their pest control records. Their pest control service providers are required to keep, the properties keeps documentation on how many treatments have had. The other is through a visual inspection. So at the time that they go to look at a unit, if the property manager has provided pest control records and they look and they see no evidence of infestation, they may clear that, but 4 days later, if the tenant calls back and says, I still have mice, that case is usually reopened, or a new case would be reopened. But inspections are a point in time, so they have to go by what they see at the time, but that doesn't prevent the tenant from calling back if the conditions change.
Got it. And again, when do you say that you're coming back with a draft of the regulations for the bill?
We're working on that.
I need a date.
I know. I'm hoping for sometime in November.
November. All right. Thank you. Jill, back.
And my apologies, I just caught my faux pas in my introduction. I promoted both of you, so my apologies to President Glass, but congratulations to both of you too for your promotion.
We appreciate the faith that you have in us. It's a mutual feeling of trust and faith. But with that, let me turn it over to Councilmember Juana.
I just missed the promotions, I guess. That's all right though. But oh, there we go. All right.
I was looking at the templates.
Well,
Yeah.
it's
Sort of like when I made you a senator.
Yeah. Well, that was good though. So yeah, appreciate and I know we'll go through the questions, so I won't ask stuff directly related to the questions. But so November on the regulations-ish. I know we've been talking about this. To Councilman Friedsen's point about making sure we have the anticipated number of inspectors and the money ahead of time. I know some of that was included in the fiscal note when we passed the bill, but if that's changing at all based on you've just gotten through this troubled properties list, and as you're doing the regulations, I guess that would be my first question. Do you think those numbers still hold of what you'll need, or is that a moving target, or?
For enforcing rent stabilization, we believe they still hold. As if we get through, but part of this is how the rent stabilization law interacts with other laws, and as we're
that didn't include this interaction, for example.
Right, because when we put the fiscal impact statement in, that was before the troubled and at-risk properties had been added in council sessions.
Sure.
But I don't anticipate that this is going to require additional staffing for compliance with other laws. But as with any changes in our workload, we will always notify the county executive and you all, with data to back it up when we have experienced an increase in workload or demand.
Okay, that's helpful. Sticking with the resources question, and we've talked about this a little bit in when you were here before on this topic. Do we have enough tools in the toolbox to incentivize, correct, when you have problems? And so I would love to hear your additional thoughts on that. I say it in the context of, I know Councilmember Mink isn't here, but I know, the Enclave, for example, has serious issues. And it's tough because thousands of people live there, but it's a huge property. So, just understanding all the challenges that are going on there, do we have enough? Do you have enough to, as far as laws or authority, to do what you need to do to create the outcomes we want, which is safe, habitable housing for everybody?
That is, and Nathan could add some details. We've been talking with Councilmember Mink and other council members about these issues and the limits on our ability to enforce the code. And we've also talked with, for example, we don't enforce all aspects of housing code. For example, for elevators, which is a problem at some particular properties, inspections are done by the state's Department of Labor. And they have basically the same regime we do. They can issue notices of violation. If there's not compliance, they can issue citations. Those citations then go through, if they aren't remedied, they then go through the court system, and the landlord may or may not have to pay. But if a landlord, if citations or even a notice of violation is not incentive enough for a landlord, either because they can't pay or they've done the calculations and it makes more sense to pay the citation than
to fix the elevator,
because it's a considerable expense, then that's where we run into limitations of our enforcement capabilities. And so we've been talking with the Office of the County Attorney. We've also begun conversations with other jurisdictions and looking at how other jurisdictions handle this. For example, some jurisdictions include in their consumer protection law landlord and tenant issues. The consumer protection law in Montgomery County specifically exempts landlord-tenant issues.
Right.
And consumer protection, this is usually about deceptive business practices. So things with, the Maryland AG's office just made a press release, was in the news a couple of weeks ago about getting a $150,000 settlement about fees issues. But consumer protection laws can also deal with housing conditions because it could be a deceptive business practice to offer a safe, stable, habitable property based on the lease, and then if you're not meeting the housing code, that is a difference. There are also some jurisdictions that have receivership laws where the jurisdiction can take the landlord to court, and a judge, usually a landlord needs to have taken things to a pretty extreme level about not remediating housing code violations. A judge can order can appoint a receiver who takes control of the property, receives the rents and makes repairs, and then eventually, when the property's been brought up to code, the property is returned to the control of the owner. We don't have a law like that here. And so on the one hand, there are some remedies that the state has that we don't have. And then there are some remedies that neither we nor the state have that it may be worthwhile to look into if you have a landlord who decides for whatever reason not to comply.
Well, I appreciate that. And so it sounds like the answer is no, you don't have enough tools. And again, this is for, the vast majority of landlords are doing the right thing. But when you have a situation where you have a 15-story building where the elevator is going to be out for 6 months and you have seniors in the building and people do the analysis, I'm just giving one example of, that's just unacceptable. We need to have faster, and there's a lot of reasons, but we need to have more and faster tools to remedy those situations. Or any other situation where you have someone who's just not doing what they're supposed to do because they've made the cost benefit, or they've played out how long it's going to take to, the courts are back, how long it's going to take to go through the process, or whatever it is. And so I would love to see, as part of this process, kind of a Venn diagram of sorts of, what does the state have, what do we have, where are the holes. And I think receivership is obviously one of those. The amount of fines and the ability, some of it's going to be state jurisdiction, but this is something we're going to have to work with the state on, right? State legislators on, because they are obviously concerned too. And I feel like going into this January, we should have a sense of what are the things at our level that we could do, and what are the things that the state could do. Again, in the most urgent situations, because those are the most frustrating, right? For residents. And so I appreciate you being candid. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
I was going to say about the property in question. We have started meeting with the state elevator inspectors. We've had several meetings with them to make sure that our efforts are sort of coordinated. The other area where we have started to use some tools that we haven't used in the past is citing more frequently. So there are certain circumstances where you can cite per day. So we're citing more frequently at some of those properties. At one of them that we keep talking about, we've got inspectors there almost every single day. And we're issuing more citations. The challenge is it takes no less than 6 months to go to court if we issue a citation. Often those citations, if by the time they go to court, the work has been completed, then that citation, the fines.
So there's almost no incentive if you're going to get to it at some point.
Yeah, right.
There's almost no incentive to worry about the citation.
Yeah, and we have another sort of tool in our toolbox that we haven't used because of some technology issues, and that's the ability to increase the inspection fees if we have to go back. Right now, we don't have the technology to apply those increased fees, so it's another area where we're working with our inside IT folks as well as TEBS to have the software be able to appropriately put those increased inspection fees on when we have to go back from multiple
What is the
times.
fee now if you go in and you have a violation? Let's say what's the fee for the elevator?
It depends on the size of the property. We don't cite for elevators.
Yeah, we don't do elevator because it's state.
Yeah, this is if we're going for
for mold.
No, it's for, usually I'm talking about for our mandated inspection. So when we go in and we do an inspection for a troubled property, we inspect that whole property the whole year. 100% of that property. It's when we go back that we can increase the fees, not per violation per unit.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I know we're going to go through the list of questions. I appreciate that, and I just really am concerned. As you see, these questions are more around capacity and what we actually have the ability to inspect, but then to actually get the behavior changed. I think that you heard the consistent theme with that, and I know we'll go into who was on the list, and it relates to and why they're on the list. But so appreciate that, and we'll continue the conversation.
And I will say,
that.
to a certain degree, it's not as fast as we like. The multiple citations, more than one a month, is they're feeling the impact of that, because I get the calls from the property owners and the landlords. So when Ms. Williams says, I'm going to this property and we're going to go every day, or I'm going to cite once a week until this violation's been fixed, the landlords and the owners start calling me, and I say, well, fix it.
Right. They try to go around.
Yeah.
Do what Ms. Williams told you to do.
They say, we're being harassed. You're not being harassed. You're not providing the service you're supposed to be providing to the residents of Montgomery County.
Right. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, why don't we go through? We have a lot of questions here. Some are pretty straightforward. Some, I think, beg additional questions. So why don't we just go through for the interests of the public and so we can have a conversation and go through those questions one by one if we could. So you want me to ask the questions, then you to respond to what you have here briefly? Is that the easiest way to do it? Okay. So these are questions that were essentially transcribed from the prior conversation that we had, which the department has followed up on. So the first question is about single-family rentals and what is the number that is in the overall inspection data set?
So our head of the licensing office checked this, and it's roughly about the same, a little less than 25,000.
Okay, so there's about 25,000, and that's been a major topic of conversation, discussion for single-family rentals. Any follow-up conversation there, Councilmember Jawanda?
So just to be 100% clear, 25,000 that you are aware, about 25,000 that you're aware of that are registered. These are folks that have actually registered to rent their property. So it's obviously way underreported.
That would be likely, and that also doesn't include those that are doing short-term rentals. That may have registered through HHS or not
like
registered.
Airbnb or something like that.
Yeah, or may or may not have registered through HHS for that type of service.
Do we have any way to get a sense of the scale of that, of those two buckets? Either unregistered or short-term?
I know that HHS contracts with an outside software provider that scrapes the online sites for
Right, 'cause
short-term
they're promoting
rentals.
it. A lot of these are promoted online.
Right. And so I think that would be a question for them about the total number of short-term rentals. And I know that it is significantly order of magnitude more than those that are registered. But for us, it gets a bit more complicated. It would have to, try to it would be very labor intensive to try to scrape sites like Craigslist or other
Right.
places where they're listing,
It's
just like
nearly
you-
impossible to know what we don't know.
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
Where we do find out sometimes, though, are through complaints, where a resident will call and complain and say, I'm renting this property, the landlord's not fixing it. Then we go and we look on our database and we see that property's not registered or licensed with us.
Yeah. And so then we follow up with, you're leasing, like a house in contravention of the law, you need to fill out your licensing fee.
And this is the last question I have on this, the 25,000 are when the house is rented, right?
Yes.
Not the room.
It would, house or
You-
condo.
I'm sorry, the property.
Unit. The unit is rented.
you,
unit.
you don't need a license to rent an individual.
not
room. So
for a
that
rooming
is not
house.
included. in
Right.
this.
So you don't even track that.
No,
Yeah.
we're not.
Yeah,
We're not
we're not
allowed
doing
to.
it.
There's
Yeah,
no
yeah.
regulatory
Right,
regime
right.
related to room rentals.
Right. So just to be clear, we've talked about that in the past of whether that should exist or not. But okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Good to know what we don't know, but we have at least a floor.
Okay, so you've talked a lot about updating databases, and this is going to be a theme for me today. So just get ready. In the answer to this question, embedded in it is a very antiquated database. So within the 25,000 nearly single-family licensed properties that have been identified here, you can really do almost no analysis because my sense is, based on the written response, you have inspectors that are writing in notes into that property, not tags. So, notes are not searchable in a database, right? Tags are searchable. So you could, then pull up a report and analyze data to determine how many properties had this issue and how many properties had that issue. So it's not nothing to have notes. It allows for an investigation into an individual property to have essentially a track record of what has happened over the course of multiple inspectors, so that Inspector A and Inspector B and Inspector C can essentially communicate via the database by the notes that they're taking, and hopefully they're taken thoroughly, and I trust our inspectors are doing that. But it doesn't really help us to make policy. It doesn't really help us to understand what the magnitude of the challenges are. It doesn't really help you to direct resources and personnel within the department to make thoughtful management decisions. So the question here is, are we changing the database and getting out of the dark ages here of what essentially is one step removed from having a manual spreadsheet where people are writing their notes by hand? I mean, this is one step better barely than that, to a system that has a database that can be searched, that can be analyzed, that can use data, and that can be much more systematic.
Yeah, so that's what we're working toward, is to have all of our data integrated. We're probably going to use tax ID number as a common identifier. There's some complexities about that, but tax ID is probably the most static identifier about a property, and we will use that to link the information between code and licensing, our compliance division, our multifamily division, Ulta, COC, and so you will, on the back end, eventually I would be able to look up through our back end portal and see everything we know about each rental property across the full spectrum of the services or administrative actions we take.
Yeah, appreciate that. So, I mean, obviously much better, not perfect. Tax ID, if you have separate LLCs, you're going to have separate tax IDs. If the underlying owner could be the same, but the entity that owns it is different. But it's certainly better than the system that we have now, so that would be a positive step. So I appreciate that. I'll note that the more, it's an exponential benefit to making things more technologically advanced. So, for instance, if you allow for the ability to pay for multiple licenses at once, which would be a significant administrative benefit to property owners, you also could tag their properties that they are related. Mm-hmm. So, if I have one payment that's coming in and it's covering 22 properties all at once, that means that those properties are affiliated with one another in some form or fashion. They may not be the exact same ownership. There could be different debt or investors and certain, but generally that they are related, and you could tag that in your system. So I would just encourage you to really think through this. We should be trying to make it more user friendly on the front end, and then easier to use from a data perspective and a management perspective on the department side as well. So I think you could accomplish both, but we're not there. We're not there yet. But I appreciate that you're working towards that, and several of my questions relate to, and I just want to highlight that our data just isn't very good right now, and we need to get better at that. And I know there's a commitment from the department to do that.
Absolutely.
So the second question was, who owns rental licenses for single-family rentals, and are there common landlords for multiple properties? This one is related to the last one, of similar to what I just noted, but I'll let you respond.
Do you want to answer that one, or would you like me to?
Sure. So we did provide a chart that talks about the classification of single-family rentals, and it goes through common ownership communities, corporations, HOC, LLCs, partnerships, sole proprietorships, trusts, and nonprofits. The preponderance of the properties are, for our single families, fall into the sole ownership or sole proprietorship category with 7,359. But like before, it's fairly hard for us to identify exactly, if there are multiple owners for multiple properties, just based on the structure of how those properties are set up.
Appreciate it. And just to bring it back to the last conversation, if you did a tax ID number, the overwhelming number of these would be covered, because that would cover sole proprietor, individual owner, and so that would be 7,359 of the 8,567 in the condo category, and 13,710 of 16,037 on the single family. So it does note that, not perfect, but it does cover a substantial proportion of these properties. So I think moving in that direction,
And we're also hoping
indicates would help.
by having a common identifier which is translatable to state records, to be able to pull in state data records, say on licensed businesses. And so that may help us as well.
Yeah, let me turn it over to Councilmember Flanagan-Fowles.
And also the lead paint from the state. If you're renting a home, you have to get that inspection. So it's not just the, so it's also EPA, the environmental department. They also have the record. But I'm still not sure, especially with seniors who may have a home, and we talk, you know, they have a home and then you rent it out because you're moving to, let's say, Leisure World. But the house is under a person's name. It's not a sole ownership. It's not an LLC. It's just the person's name, because she only owns one home. So where is that? You don't have that here.
No, that would fall under the sole ownership or
Yeah,
proprietor.
but okay, but if you don't have you don't have a tax ID for that. If you're your own person,
Then usually you're,
the Social Security is not gonna be, yeah, but it won't be an item number. You know what I mean? It has to be the Social Security number. That's what I'm trying to get here. That you need to include that too.
Yeah, well, no, there are complexities with this. There's no perfect common identifier.
A senior will not go and mess with an LLC or creating a sole ownership just to fill this. So I just want to make sure that you also have for those cases, there are probably a few, but they are out there.
Yeah, we looked at things like square and lot, but that has other complications to it, as ways to.
And just to clarify, when you say tax ID, you mean tax ID, EIN for a business,
Yeah.
and Social Security number for an individual.
that's a.
I didn't take it that
question.
way.
We'd have to follow
Yeah,
up.
that's a licensing question. I
Or
don't.
no.
You do not need a tax ID to get your license.
No, I believe they use the Social Security number.
You use your social. That's what I'm saying. Because when you mention it, when I see this, I'm thinking of the tax ID as a business. I don't see this as Social Security number included here. So right now you're saying that you're including people under your sole ownership proprietor. I can't say that word.
Proprietorship.
Proprietorship. Okay. You're including people who have a Social Security number in this group. You shouldn't, because it's a separate thing.
Yeah.
You need to divide that.
It's part of what we're working through with TABS is, in trying to come up with, because we have to have the common identifier, because that's the thing that links it all together. And so, yeah, it's complicated.
And I need to go back, but I don't even think you need a Social Security number. All you're asking, because I've seen the form, is the address of the home, who owns the home. That's it. You don't ask for Social Security number. You don't ask for ITIN number. None of that. You don't. I'm just telling you, because I've done the process. You didn't know that, right? So.
We'll follow up with licensing on that.
Yeah, I mean, I had some assumptions in my head, but I don't want to go out there, like,
Just
I
the
only go
address.
as far as my expertise goes, so.
It's just the address.
There is one other statement I wanted to make. It's not a question that was asked, but the other thing that we'd like to start to look at is whether or not some of the owners would, right now they have a separate license number for every single property that they have. And when you start to look at the properties that are troubled, and you really take a look at the number of properties and the addresses and the unit size, the preponderance of these properties are small properties. They're 3-4 unit buildings, 5 unit buildings. We even have some that are multifamily, but there are only 2 units in the building. We have some landlords who own 4 units in a row. There might be 4 units in each building, and all of them will show up on our troubled property list because we found 1 roach in 1 unit. And the way we designate properties as troubled now, part of the criteria is if 20% or more of the units show infestation, that will automatically put you on the troubled property list. So some owners, if it were me.
So if you have 3 units and 1 unit has 1 roach issue
yes.
one time, that would
Yeah.
flag it. Obviously different if you have 100
Right.
unit property.
Exactly. And when you look at those 4 or 5 or 6 units in a block, and 4 or 5 or 6 are each individual property because they registered by the address and the tax ID. If those were collapsed, then you would probably see a lot of those small under 5 unit buildings coming off the troubled property list.
Yeah, and I don't want to step in, but this is a very important point, and one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to make sure we figure out the connection between the properties. It's not just to go after landlords. It's to understand the nature of the issue. And if 77 properties is actually a much smaller number in reality, we should know that, and residents should know that. And, that is information that I think would be helpful, to really get a good handle on what we're talking about here for our own internal purposes, for resource, and just more broadly to understand the nature of, just how prevalent these issues are. If, 77 unrelated properties that could be up to 100, 200, 300 person units, the scale of that is much bigger than some of the circumstances that you just described. And we know that the troubled properties, they're not all created equally. Some are extremely and chronically troubled, and some may be on the list for a temporary period of time because of an individual serious incident that has to be remedied, but that is quite different by its nature. So the more data we have for that, I think the better for all of us to do our work and to share as honestly and transparent as we can with the public. But unless there's any more questions on this, why don't we move on? Do you want to go through the breakdown of the enforcement actions between multifamily and single-family rentals?
Certainly, and we received some updated information since you received this packet. So right now for administrative multifamily, the number of cases shows is 1,665. That was through April of 2023. As of today, we've added 107 to that, so the total is 1,772. Administrative cases are cases that we schedule inspections for. Complaint cases are cases where someone calls in and we go out to investigate as a result of that complaint. So for the multifamily, for the complaints, as of April 2023, there were 6,515. We increased that by almost 1,000, by 907, and the current number is 7,422. We can send you an updated packet list with this information on it as well.
Yeah, if you could send an update, and can we just include it as an addendum to this item, so when people are looking at it, they have the most updated information. I think that would be helpful, and I just think it's important to note, it's in the packet, but this is a multi-year span between January 2019 to April 2023, right? And including the higher numbers, is that those higher numbers are updated to today, or those
are
through
updated
April
through today.
Okay, so that's the most updated number, so let's include that, but the numbers that are before us are still accurate just through April as
Yes.
opposed through present, or as close to present, end of last month, or whatever the time period is.
Right.
Okay.
And the administrative for single family increased by 229 to 2,625. And our largest increase was for the complaints under single family, which increased by nearly 1,985 was the increase, and the total number of cases were 16,815.
So between May and today, you've responded to approximately 2,000, just so under 2,000 complaints about single-family homes,
Yes.
rentals.
Well, if you add the administrative, it's over 2,000.
Over to that, but I'm saying you responded to complaints,
Complaints,
not
yes.
that you did inspections.
Yeah, 1985.
Okay.
And 917 at the multifamily.
Are we able to get information on what this would have looked like for a similar period prior to January 2019?
I'm not sure. That's before my time, so we'll have to check with our IT folks about pulling that data.
Yeah, it would just be helpful. I mean, I would love to see a snapshot in time to show how many more complaints we're responding to, how many more. And then do we have a list of the number of complaints we've received versus the number of inspections based on complaints we've conducted?
We can provide a list of the number of complaints we receive, but I'm not sure that it would correlate to the number of inspections because there are follow-up inspections that could come after that.
And there also could be multiple complaints on the same issue.
There could be multiple complaints on the same issue. Somebody could complain about multiple things. When it comes into 311, they can have a list of multiple complaints. And when we inspect, we could also inspect and find other things that we didn't see because of the
Okay,
initial
so you don't think that it would be particularly helpful? Like you could provide it to us, but you don't think it would be particularly helpful?
I'm not quite sure how well we could provide it and be inaccurate, and I don't think it would be particularly helpful.
Okay, noted. I'll turn to Councilmember Jawanda.
Thank you. So, a version of the question that was just asked, are the 900 complaints for multifamily since May, so in that 5-month period, is that typical or are we seeing it go up?
We've been fairly consistent over the years about the number of complaints that come in.
Got it. Same thing with the single family, so 2,005 months is typical.
I'm not quite sure, as sure as the single family, but I know in the multifamily it's been the same. We typically will do about 24,000. We'll receive about 24,000 complaints over the year, and that's been consistent over the past.
24,000 for what? The multifamily?
For both.
For both.
Yeah.
Okay. You're just not sure of the breakdown.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to know, just what the trend lines are. I mean, I know it was asked about the 5-year period, but are we seeing, coming out of the pandemic, for example, or are we seeing higher rates of complaints? Again, complaints just means people know what to do. It doesn't. It's one indicator of the state of things, but the administrative are things that you've initiated.
Yes.
Just through the normal process. Right.
And those increased because of the lack of interior inspections that were taking place during the COVID pandemic.
Got it.
So now we're inspecting according to schedule at capacity.
Got it. So yeah, I'd be just curious to know I just don't have the context to know if that's an increase or not. It could sound like a big number or a small number depending on what.
Out of curiosity, so if we, I agree with you, we should provide these not just by category but by time. Do you all think it would be more helpful to have it monthly or quarterly breakdowns? Because or would you prefer annually?
I think quarterly. For me, quarterly seems to make sense, but
Yeah, I mean monthly.
Yeah.
Not all months are created equally, so I think I'm sure there's upticks certain months and significant downticks other months. So I don't think that would be terribly helpful, but I think quarterly would be appropriate.
Okay.
So I think all
Yeah.
three of us agree on that.
and I'm assuming you typically see more single-family complaints just in general.
Yeah, because the complaints don't just come from the tenant. We get complaints from neighbors.
Right.
We get complaints from the general public. It could be that guy's tree fell in my property. He won't
Sure,
remove it.
sure.
It could
So
be
that
the
includes
grass
those
isn't
kind of
cut. There's
nuisance
trash.
complaints, too.
There's an empty lot that hasn't been maintained. That's a lot of complaints.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Well, that speaks to the next. I'm going to do the next three together. Essentially, there was a question about how many complaints for single-family rentals are received by neighbors compared to tenants. You don't collect that data because you don't ask people to self-identify of who they are and what their proximity is to an issue. A breakdown of complaint type and how often single-family rentals change ownership. You don't have that data. It's not something that you have. I'll just note, I'm not sure. I think most the other are appropriate, but I actually think the breakdown by complaint and type, I think that is data that you should be collecting. So as you look to improve your data, I absolutely don't think we should ask people to self-identify themselves before they call to raise a concern about safety. I don't think that that's appropriate. I actually think that could cause people to be unlikely to reach out, particularly in certain communities. And I just think that that would be unhelpful to, the safe housing that we're looking to achieve. But keeping a record of what types of complaints we're getting, I actually think it's quite helpful, and I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't be doing that. So as you look to improve the data, that's an area where I think we really should lean into, because I think it would be helpful for us as we have these types of conversations for policymaking, for budget decisions, to assess how things are going, to know what complaints are we getting, because inspections are important, but the complaints we're getting is important too.
So that's similar to what we discussed earlier, where the complaint is not a searchable field. So we would have to think about maybe having a drop-down box or something where it more specifically lets them state what that complaint is or what category that complaint falls into. Right now we can look at violations by type, but not complaints, but we'd have to sort of revamp how the complaint.
Yeah, either you could have the complainant self-identify, and it's not a perfect data set, but it's better than a nothing data set. Or, presumably you're going through these issues item by item. You could internally have a drop-down menu where they get categorized into one of 7 buckets, for instance, and you determine what the 7 buckets should be. But ultimately, as you're making a decision of what complaints to respond to, how you're reviewing those. A professional within the department is looking at it and assessing what type of complaint it is and how to respond to it. And it doesn't seem like it would be a major administrative burden as you go through that to have a field that they categorize it in, even if it doesn't get an inspection, just to have that as part of the data. So just something to think about as you internally, and the easier you make it for your internal folks, the more likely that we're going to get that. If it's a very quick thing that they can just click on, move on. Is it getting an inspection? Is it not? What's the date of the inspection? Or who does it go to next? Et cetera. I'll just note that.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out if this is more of an internal IT change, or is this a 311 change, or, yeah.
Yeah, just something to work on. Any other? Okay. There was a question of any recommendations or thoughts that you have on a proactive approach for single-family rentals. Do you want to share any thoughts that you have on that? There's 2 approaches. I think capacity and resources are probably a big part of both, but if you want to share that, go ahead.
I think the best way to address that, and when I first came to the county, I was surprised that we don't do that, is inspecting properties prior to the issuance of a license. A lot of other jurisdictions do that. Tacoma Park does that. It lets you know that when a person is moving into a property, they're moving into a property that meets the requirements of that we would expect. Right now, it's just complaint-based unless it's an ADU. We will pre-inspect ADUs, but we don't pre-inspect a regular single-family rental before a license is issued. And that would be my recommendation. It would cause us to have do more inspections, but if we're doing it as they come on, we'd have to just take a look at how many new license applications do we get per year. I'm not sure if that would be overly burdensome for us to start inspecting them based on the new license applications. And that could go into what Councilmember Fanning Gonzalez said, by checking to make sure they've got their lead-based paint certificates, their radon inspections, and the stuff to the tenant is up to date, and the property meets code.
Yeah, could you get back to us with the number of new licenses by category per year?
When you say by category?
Like single family, multifamily, condo. I mean, you're signing up as a rental property based on a category, so that should be very easily searchable. And maybe, look at a 4 or 5 year window, so so we're not just looking at a moment in time, so we have some idea of that. And then the question that I would have is, how quickly somebody requests an inspection because they want to, bring a rental unit online. How quickly would the department be in a position to respond to that currently? So if you could get back to us on that would be helpful. Obviously, if somebody wants to add rental units and they have a property that's well kept and meets all of the codes, that's a great thing. We want to help them do that as quickly as possible. So knowing how quickly that could happen, I think would be helpful for us to understand. And
right now, I don't believe we inspect new multifamily buildings. If it's a new building that comes online, we don't inspect that. That's already gone through inspection processes through other divisions of permitting services. So we don't typically inspect new buildings, I believe, until, is it 3 years after? think 3 years after the new building's been constructed is when we start doing inspections.
Yeah, I think what we're looking for more here are existing
single-family.
buildings that are not getting an occupancy and use permit. You know, it's not a new construction type, not an ADU, not a new multifamily building, but, you know, an existing building, an existing condo, single family, et cetera. You know, I think that's more of what I think we're looking at here, right?
Okay.
Okay. Question about multifamily rental properties. Can DHA determine whether a single owner owns multiple properties? And we talked about before how you don't have the capacity to do that, but you're looking at options to do that, including the tax identification number, which would include the social tax identification number is a broader category, which should include, and there's a question of whether it would include, but should include EINs, employee identification numbers, ITINs, individual tax identification numbers, and social security numbers, all of which are forms of tax ID numbers. So, but you're looking into that, you're going to get back to us. Okay. So can you just talk a little bit about, there's a big question of analyzing the troubled property list for how many properties stay on for more than the 1 year. Essentially, is this a tool that is helping to get more compliance? I mean, I think that is really at the heart of this question. The intention here isn't to have a list that says that these properties are bad properties. It's to have a list that identifies bad properties and incentivizing bad properties to be fixed and to come into compliance. At least that's the ultimate goal. So can you just speak to that?
So we were able to obtain a bit of data on that. There are 8 properties that have been on the list consecutively for 2 or 3 years. They're all small ones. Some of the larger properties and some of the ones that we frequently talk about have been troubled 1 year, at risk the next, and then maybe troubled the subsequent year. We still have more data to do to analyze that, but we do know that there are 8 properties. All of them were under 20 units that have been on since inception. And that constitutes 65 units in those 8 properties.
Okay, let me turn it over to Councilmember Joanna.
You said it constitutes how many?
65 units in those 8 properties.
Eight properties totaling 65 units that have been on the troubled properties list for
2 consecutive years.
or more, or just
Yeah.
2 consecutive years.
Right now, I'm going to say 2 consecutive
You're
years.
not sure. Okay.
Yes.
Can you give me what's the name of one of those properties? Are they in here?
They're on the property list. I think I don't want to put it on the record if I'm.
We had talked, and while you're looking for that, we had talked about this last time as well, that another way that doesn't cost any money or very limited money to make sure things change is to say what these places are.
Mm-hmm.
And
But in
not-
fairness, those small ones, it might have been a very minor issue that caused them to be on the troubled property list. And I'm sure there's some of those buildings you would go into and say, I would happily live here myself. But there might be one issue caused by one tenant that will cause you to be on the list because the units are so small. I'll get you one of the names in just a second.
And so 65 units, 8 properties, so on average, yeah. It depends on the size.
skewed, but-
Yeah. Depending.
Quebec Flats,
Yeah, that's what I thought.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Quebec
They're on there
Terrace.
4 times
Yeah.
because they've got 4 properties that are small properties.
And those are I used to live there. They're not in good shape. So that's one we've toured as council members have toured various times. Okay. So the other analysis I think would be interesting, you kind of alluded to it, is who's troubled, who's at risk, like the back and forth between troubled and at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And restate the criteria for at risk.
Well, it's easier to state the criteria for trouble.
Okay. All right. Let's start with that.
So if there's rodent infestation in more than 20% of the units, or identify mold in more than 20% of the units, or they have a specific TV and SV score, total violations and severity of violations per unit. That's the general criteria, but you will absolutely be on if you have the more than 20% infestation and mold in the units.
That's how you get on trouble. And then at risk would be
It's a lesser threshold.
something less than that, but
Yeah.
approaching
And I
it.
will tell you, though, that we are proactive about dealing with these at-risk properties, because we were clear about, the whole purpose of creating an at-risk program was to
Right.
try to prevent people from being
Yeah,
troubled.
absolutely.
So when we have properties that barely make the at-risk, we treat them like they're troubled. So there are several properties this year, or last fiscal year, that were at risk, but we still inspected 100% of the units as if they were troubled.
And that's
And
discretionary?
It's we have the ability to inspect at a higher percentage of units and a higher frequency. So it doesn't mean every 2 years. It means they must be inspected at least every 2 years. So when we find those, bad apples in the barrel, that, we see that we're getting lots of complaints. We know that they were troubled last year, but at risk last year, but they barely made it. We're going to treat them as troubled and inspect 100% of units. We did that with 2 large properties this year.
Yeah, that's a great practice. I just think, just to be clear, I think as you're doing more on this question, on this analysis, I think to that point, knowing who's kind of moving between the two over time would be good to have insight into, right? Especially if we're talking about there's 80. So if I go back to the top, there's 88 troubled, and how many at risk here? I lost the 77. No.
77 troubled.
77 troubled, and how many at risk?
At risk? 46.
46. Thank you. I know it was in here somewhere. Yeah, so it's a universe that's knowable, kind of like just knowing the continuum of where people are passing through.
We can add that analysis to our next annual report. We could just make it one of the reporting categories that we do.
Great. Thank you.
Good idea. Let's add that to the annual report category. That sounds like a good option. Okay. So this was a bit of an update, so I appreciate the fact that we asked the question. You didn't have a very good answer at first, and you found a better answer. So thank you for that. We talked already about the follow-up inspections and how the charges for that can change. You're working on your database, as you mentioned here, to make it easier to assess a higher fee for those additional inspections because of the administrative burden on the department. Can you just go through kind of the process, how the website works, any changes you're making to the website to make it an easier format?
The DHCA website?
Yeah. Well, DHCA website insofar as it relates to the posting of troubled properties. So there's been a concern, and you heard it at the last hearing from back in the winter, that this is not particularly easy to find.
Yeah, so the simple answer to that is we're going to publish the actual report on the website. So there will be a link to the website where it gives you a little bit of history about, how the troubled property program came into play. It will list the past and most recent troubled property reports. And like Director Bruton said, we're going to try to integrate a actually dynamic part of that page that will show you if they've been removed from the report. You can look and see who's troubled as of this date right now, as opposed to who was troubled at the time of the report was submitted in September.
Got it. And yeah, I had suggested this at the last hearing. I'll just reiterate. I still think it would be better to have a specific hotline, a specific place where people can upload pictures and raise
So
concerns.
they can actually do that. If they go on to MC311's online portal, they can upload videos, they can upload pictures, they can put their whole complaint and their request right there in MC311's portal.
And that will go to you.
That comes to us just as if it came through 311. Yes.
Okay.
So one of the things that we're doing throughout our programs as well is we are, in addition to updating the website, we can reference that on the website, but we also are creating some fact sheets for each division, and where some of it's crossing divisions. So if Ulta has a fact sheet that says, hey, here's what you need to do to complain about an Ulta issue, also, here's what you need to complain if you have an issue related to maintenance or repair in your home, and it will jump to that, point them to that database.
And how many languages is that available in? If somebody goes,
It's not, we're doing that now, and right now we do everything in English and in Spanish. We can look to see, I don't want to commit, but there's some translation resources available that might make it easier if it's on the website to find it.
I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
I'm at the website right now, NC311, so it takes you to the Montgomery County, and you click on housing complaints. It's just really hard to get to. Then once you open it, you have this huge paragraph, and I don't see where you can actually upload photos.
Once you start the process, you can't just, it's not on the very first page. You have to start the process, act like you're going to create a complaint, and then you'll see a tab at the bottom that says,
You'll be provided with an option to upload photos with your service request after clicking the submit. Yeah, I see it now. It's just so, it's really bad. Especially once you see it and you see this huge, you have to go all the way down.
And what we can consider is putting a link to that on our website so it'll take you right there.
Yes, you need that. And like even all of us on the county council, we attended an event by Action in Montgomery, and these are people who are very involved in the community. Okay, like I'm telling you, hundreds, maybe thousands at this point of members, and they have no idea. I didn't know that you could actually upload photos. They have no clue this is actually already available. It's just hard to find, which is me. It's like you don't have it because it's hard to find.
If you can't find it, it doesn't exist.
Exactly. So yeah, definitely work on that while you have the website being built that we're talking about.
Okay.
And if you send us a fact sheet or something, we can help promote. Use us. Put it on social media so we can retweet and tell our partners.
And speaking about that, it's not also a discussion in this forum, but the Ulta division has also been working a lot more closely with some of our service providers, Action in Montgomery, and we're working with all of them and trying to train them. Director Bruton last year has actually started having some sessions with them so that we can talk to them and make sure that they're well educated about what our processes and policies are, and we'll continue to do that. I didn't mean to steal your thunder there.
Appreciate it. I would go take a look at the site. It is not particularly user-friendly. It's a lot of text for folks who English is not their first language. It is not the easiest to utilize. So I just, some thought there I think would be helpful, to have a few members of your team who deal with residents on a regular basis, who are actually filing the complaints, and kind of have a feel for how these complaints get issued, to really dive in and make some suggestions there, because I think there's some work where that could be improved, but I'm glad that we're moving in that direction. So I do appreciate that.
We actually have a dedicated code outreach worker who does outreach just specifically for code, so we can have her definitely work
that would be great.
I'd like to give her a shout out. Her name is Charlotte Cherry Quintanilla, and she's out in the community all the time.
Well, we appreciate her, and we appreciate your interest in lifting her up here. So thank you to her and to you for that. We talked about this quite a bit at the last meeting about whether or not it makes sense and would be appropriate and in keeping with the purpose of this program to issue a report of this list annually to incentivize folks wanting to get off the list. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. You mean beyond doing a press release on the, obviously I have to check with the county executives folks on any press release, but I'm assuming that they would be amenable to doing this. So yeah, we could do an annual press release around the annual troubled properties report and direct people to the website where they can find the report.
Yeah, I would stick to the troubled properties. I think it would be a reason to get off that list, and would provide some interest in getting off that list, and I would do it around the same time every year. I'll just note the state for many years has had a tax scofflaws, effort where there's the biggest scofflaws who are individual taxpayers and who are business taxpayers. And I will say that there is, at least my experience had been, there was an influx of compliance leading up to the issuing of that report. People had a sense of when it was happening, and there were concerns about not wanting to be on that list. And so it's not generally my approach that we should start with this type of approach, but I think that, in the case of a troubled property, highlighting that has issues that need to be resolved and incentivizing that they be resolved, I think is appropriate.
Okay.
So, all right. We have a question about tenants obtaining renters insurance. I know that came up at the last conversation. Generally, landlords require tenants to have renters insurance as a condition of a lease. So I don't know that you need to respond to that, but there's no county or state law that mandates it, but generally that's handled through the lease, and obviously is an important issue to make sure that if something happens, things are covered, and there are different things that an HO6 policy would cover versus a master policy of a condo or other common ownership community versus a renter, including like their personal belongings, et cetera.
Sure. And we do, in our landlord-tenant handbook and other places, recommend that folks get renters insurance.
Appreciate that. And you noted this earlier a little bit, but what's the remedy if the source of the problem is another tenant in an adjacent unit, right? So the 20% issue, a small property,
We do have the ability to
tenant.
cite a violation in that other unit. But if it's single-family home, sometimes it ends up becoming a civil issue. But if it's something that we can see and it's obvious for us to see, and we can cite for that.
So
But
generally, if it's not in a single-family home, the building, you have the ability to work with the property
landlord
owner
or the
to
property, yes.
address it, because they have obligations to the other units, and generally have the ability, if there's an emergency or a violation of law or some other issue, can go in. But in a single-family home,
Yep.
it
So
gets
if
a
in a
little bit
single-family home,
trickier
for example,
because
if there's uncut grass, or there's piles of debris, or there's garbage outside, we see all of that causes rodents, and those rodents make their way into the house next door, we will cite the owner that's causing the problem, because we can visibly see that from the street or from the ground.
Got it. Okay.
And we did skip 14, and I did want to, just for the
Oh, I'm
record,
sorry.
make a mention about that. It's can county require landlords to publicly disclose recent complaints received for property or individual units. There is also an e-property database that's open to the public, where anybody can go in, put in an address or a property name, and find all of the violations and the status of those violations on that portal.
By unit.
Yep. Okay. Great. And let me turn it over to Councilmember Madrona.
Yeah, and I was just looking at the list. I scrolled enough to find the troubled properties list. At the far end, it has a rating, and it says like 15 troubled, 1 troubled. No, I'm sorry. I think that's 2 things. So they're all troubled. That's the rating. What's the no-co alarm violation? What is that?
CO and alarms, if they don't have
That's
carbon monoxide
carbon
or
monoxide. Okay, got it. All right, and then smoke alarm, mold, infested. Got it. Okay. And then you talked about this earlier. You kind of said it in the beginning. As I eyeball this list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's like 8 or 9, 10 or 11, give or take, that are over 100 units.
right.
Right, so it's the majority are small. Some are significant, right? Like Summit Hills and Enclave. There's ones that have large amounts, thousands of units. But
There's 15 that are 100 plus units.
there you go. Okay, better than my eyeball. is there a different strategy and approach, and could you describe it for for us and for residents, when you have something like that is going to have a lot more, which when you say 20% of 100, that's either 20 plus units of a 100 unit building, but if it's, if it's bigger, if it's like 1,000 units, it's, it's over 200 units, so it's a significant problem that put it on the list. How do you approach those large properties vis-a-vis the smaller ones, like the strategy and approach?
So, the most challenging one is infestation. And what we require as part of their corrective action plan is to tell us what they're going to do about the problem. I used to be a landlord, and I know that dealing with infestation is not something that the property can do by itself. It's something that's the property's responsibility, it's the resident's responsibility, and it's your pest control service provider's responsibility. So they have to provide to us what their strategy is going to be. Oftentimes, if there's a serious infestation, they may say, we're going to exterminate, 100% of the units every other month or every 2 months. Where you have a smaller property with 1 or 2 units with infestation, that's an easier thing to resolve. The other thing is that it's the landlord's responsibility to address those persistent problems, which sometimes they don't. So when you have a hoarder, or you have, somebody who's just not maintaining their property in a manner to prevent pests from coming in, the landlord has to address that. And if they don't, it's not fair to the other tenants who live in that building. So I think when we're dealing with infestation, it's that. The other issue is like water and mold. Some of our properties have some systemic problems with water and mold. Right. And when they submit their corrective action plan, we're not just going to see, I fixed the mold. You don't fix the mold if you don't fix the water. So our inspectors know when they're reviewing those corrective action plans to make sure that they're really looking at what the root source of the problem is, and not just putting a Band-Aid or some paint on it.
I appreciate that. I mean, you kind of led into my last question, which is, some of this stuff is, particularly with the smaller units, really, really old properties that are going to have systemic and structural issues, and they're just, for whatever reason, there's not been the willingness or the market to redevelop, right? And I think in your other side of the hat, Mr. Director Bruton, on how we make sure that there's enough access to affordable housing, I do think that, and we've talked about this in the past, right, for some of these properties, I'll just use where I grew up in Quebec Terrace, which has been bad since I was there 40 years ago. We should be proactively thinking of what our role is as the county to go in and see what we can do, whether either purchasing, incentivizing others to purchase, joint development, whatever, and some of these ones that are just going to be on the list because the folks don't have the money or the willingness or the ability to fix what needs to be fixed in a building that was built in 1930 or 1950 or whatever, So we've talked about that a little bit, but I would love to see, as part of the other side of your house, thinking about who would be candidates for that. And we can't do it all at once, right? And it depends on a whole bunch of factors, partners, private sector, whatever. But what could be our role in thinking about that? And maybe you are, but I just want to throw that out there. And you are. Okay.
Yeah, no, we're absolutely thinking about that. I mean, personally, I tend to view rental housing as providing a service and it not being a commodity. And just as if you're a doctor or a restaurateur and you're not able to provide the service, then the government will do something about it. And part of the expectation of providing this service is that you have, a clean unit that complies with the housing code and doesn't have infestations. And there are, whether it's because of a lack of capacity to run the property well, or if it's the business model to disinvest and draw money out of the property, and assume that you're always going to have people who are so on the brink that someone will always rent there no matter how bad it is, then it's up to us to make it so that it is not financially feasible to pursue that business model in the county. You are required to maintain a certain level of habitability in your properties. And if you're not willing to do that, then you shouldn't,
Yeah.
you get my point.
Yeah, and I was assuming good intentions, but there obviously could be bad intentions as well. And I think you've heard from the whole committee here that, like, we're interested in this a lot, and we want to be a partner in that. So I would just ask that we continue those conversations, and again, back to my first question, give us the tools to do that, so that we don't have these repeat. So, thank you.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
But, and I love the comments, but following up on that, especially for us as a county to partner, let's say we have a travel property and we did this in Aspen Hill, we purchased a building, right? Requires money. And as a county, we need to invest more on the housing fund that we have and all these different programs that we have going on to be able to have the money power to ensure that we can uplift all these buildings that are in bad shape and, by themselves they can't get redeveloped. The county needs to step it up. And so I look forward to seeing the budget coming up. And it's going to be a tough one, again. But money talks. So there you go.
Yeah, appreciate that. We have a nonprofit housing fund that will be coming shortly that we've been working really hard on. I've been talking about for several years, and appreciate Director Bruton, your partnership on that, and look forward to us moving forward relatively quickly, actually maybe even quicker than we were originally anticipating, which is positive. So I think that's one tool. I do think we have to be realistic here, though. The idea that a nonprofit partner is going to be incentivized from taking on a property that has tens of millions of dollars potentially in issues, that's an unfair request that we would be making of a nonprofit that has to have a way to pay for this. So, ultimately, to the points that I think are being making here, we need partners, but we need to give them money to do the things that we want them to do. If there was a better way for the market to do it, it probably would be doing it already. And so these are examples of properties where the business model might not work, and it might require us to step in some form or fashion, and that probably means quite a bit of money, and it probably means quite a bit of public money in order to do that, if we want the housing to stay housing, and if we want it to remain. I'll note, I looking at the list, virtually all of the properties that we're talking about are what we would generally refer to as naturally occurring affordable housing. These tend not to be new buildings that have chronic problems. These are older units, some of which have deferred maintenance for a variety of reasons, some of which have systemic challenges, some of which were built with different codes and different standards that are expensive to bring up to modern day requirements and codes, and that costs a lot of money. And so there is a balance, and I will note sometimes it is better to build something new. There is a point of no return where having a property that is not able reasonably to be kept up to a high enough standard, it would probably serve all of our purposes to build something new there and probably have a lot more units there as well to provide more housing to more people. There are a lot of times where preserving it would be helpful because you can provide it at a cost that a new property could not possibly achieve because the cost of building something new is prohibitively expensive with today's interest rates and construction standards and et cetera. So I think it speaks to the complexity of these issues. I think we need to be careful of the one size fits all approach, but I think having additional tools at our disposal, targeting our focus on those properties that are having problems and need to be resolved so that we don't have anybody who is living in substandard housing, I think makes a lot of sense. Speaking of that, which requires enforcement, the next three questions are really about the number of code enforcers, the rate of turnover for inspectors, and the department's efforts at the request of this committee to move towards a standardized checklist for inspectors, which has been a frequent concern that we've heard from both property owners and from complainants, generally renters. Could you just speak to those? I think they're all related, so if you want to just speak to them together.
So we'll reference that we currently have our budgeted for 36 code inspectors. We have 33 on staff right now and 4 supervisors.
And I'll just note that is a significant increase from when Councilmember Jawando and I were upstairs on the 7th floor for our first review of the recently passed troubled properties law, where the number of inspectors was way down. It was basically half that. And so there has been a concerted effort over the last several years, even in a challenging labor market, frankly, where we've had tons of vacancies in county government, in Montgomery County, just like local governments around the region. This is an area where we have seen a positive focus, and it just shows that if you focus on something, if the committee is insistent on something, if the department is committed to something, that we actually can move the needle. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Yep. And our turnover rate currently is about 6.25%. That's usually
Which is great.
3 or 4 people a year. Unfortunately, DPS likes to steal our folks. It's a promotional opportunity for them. So, when you have a division that has, 35, 36 inspectors, only 4 supervisors, there's no upward mobility to go unless there's a supervisory vacancy. And DPS, the way their inspectors go, they have a lot more levels. So we've lost several of our great folks to DPS, which I'm happy that they had that opportunity, but sad that they left.
Well, we're glad that we're keeping them
Within the
in
county.
service to the public and in county government. So always good to see upward mobility and advancement in people's careers. That's not necessarily a negative.
Yes. And regarding the checklist, we have been talking about this intently for a while. There's some challenges with it, but we think we may have a way to incorporate something in shorter order. Part of it, the way the inspectors inspect now, they use an app. An app was developed, and it has drop downs by room for them to identify what those violations are. There are 2 things that we're considering right now, and we're going to continue meeting with not just the management staff, but with the inspectors as well, to find out which is better between these two solutions. One of them is to have just a general checklist that they're required to use. They would still enter their data the way that they enter it now. But they would also check off that they utilize that checklist, and that checklist would have a list of pretty much all the violations from the building interior, the exterior, the common areas, the grounds, where they would be expected to inspect. But they would not be checking off a checklist as they're doing in the inspection, because that would involve having to redo the application. The second one is redoing the application to the point where they've got to go through every single possible violation and check yes or no that they see a deficiency and see what it is. The concern with that is that it would seriously lengthen the time that it takes to do an inspection. And I don't know if folks realize, but right now, if we go to inspect a large property, the Enclave, we might be there for 4 days with 15 inspectors. So we have to pull inspectors off of other teams to do that. And oh, by the way, the landlord or the property owner also has to have 15 staff to accompany all of those inspectors as they go unit to unit over that 4-day period. So we're looking at what's going to be the most expeditious way for us to ensure that our inspectors are being thorough and particular about identifying violations, but also can weighing, into taking into consideration how long it takes to get an inspection done. So we're meeting with the team. We hope to have something probably within the next 2 months with the final decision. That won't be implemented, but we'll know exactly what direction we plan to go.
Well, you'll come back to us with that. Obviously, we want to find an appropriate balance here. You know what we're looking for, but you all are the folks who are in the field doing the work, and so let's find a way to achieve the overarching objective, but in a way that allows you to do your job better and doesn't inhibit you from, being able to do your job well. So, I don't think there's any interest, or has there ever been an interest in,
The process.
creating something that doesn't work. We want to create something that makes sense and that works, but, a checklist and providing some level of uniformity to give confidence both to property owners and to tenants and complainants, oftentimes the same, but not always. I think that would be helpful, and I think it'll help the inspectors to feel like, they're going to, there are sometimes people who are not always thrilled to see an inspector, I could imagine, but to have something to lean on to say, I'm not making independent judgments here of what I'm looking at. I have, a manual that tells me what I have to do my job, and I'm just doing my job. I think, that tends to help, from my perspective, inspectors. So get back to us on that and help us on that. I'm going to
Sure.
turn to Director Bruton and then to Councilmember Jawanda, if that's
I'll
okay.
just say that Code is also working on augmenting our standard operating procedures and creating a more standardized training regime. So for the gentlemen who are going to be going through training behind me, we're trying to standardize it more instead of it being kind of based on the individual proclivities of the trainer you happen to be assigned to. And I think those two things will also help will just also help with improvements as far as standardization, like better outcomes.
And there's more. I started to say, but wait, there's more. We are implementing our quality control measures. So the supervisors are starting to go back and do some follow-up inspections on the inspections that the inspectors did to make sure that they're meeting the quality of the inspection that we expect them to have. So that's something that's actually getting written into performance metrics. So Kashamba and the other 3 supervisors will be actually going out inspecting, maybe 5% somewhere, a certain percentage of the properties that their team does to ensure the quality of those inspections.
That was a lot of expect. That was very impressive. That was a ton, yeah, a lot of yeah. I meant to ask this earlier, and so just going back, the fines. We didn't. So you can't track. You don't have the number of fines listed here, right? We weren't able to get that. Is this a limitation of the database? And then as far as just associating it with the properties and how many fines are outstanding, do we have a sense of that?
The fines, the reason that and if you look at this troubled property report and last year's troubled property report where it talks about fines, it says the amount of fines collected are negligible, has to do with the court system. We tell you there's 6 months to get into court, but that's at least 6 months. We have some cases that are over a year that haven't gone into court yet. So they don't really pay until they've been adjudicated through the court and say, here, you have to pay. So, and then the other aspect is that oftentimes by the time we get to court, if the owner is able to prove that the violation was corrected prior to the court date, then they just automatically will dismiss the case.
Right. So is that back to our earlier conversation of tools in the toolbox to make it a real incentive to actually do something? Because it seems like the stick you have is not really it's more of a twig.
Mm-hmm. It's your mom spanking you versus your dad.
Yeah. Okay. So then I guess this year in this report the amount of fines would be negligible again.
Yes, that's what the report says.
Yeah, and what is negligible? Like, do you have a range? Like, I don't need the exact number, but is it $1,000 or $10,000? Like, what does that mean?
Let me see if we actually put that in the report. Just 1 second.
Because again, as you're looking, I think if we say we have fines that we can charge, then we're assessing fines, and then it's never happening. It's almost just on a piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay, but you get my point,
I
right?
do.
Like, just what's the point? If I mean, obviously we want them to fix the behavior, but again, as you said, it could be 6 months, a year. There's a long period of time, and again, you don't want people having to stay in those situations. So I'm sorry, Director Bruton, you were going to say something.
no, I just agreeing. It's, you know, it's a problem. I mean, especially if the court dismisses the fines once they've complied, and you have several months to comply, that's not really helping the tenant in their situation. And so that time in court is significantly problematic. But we have to feel for the court because they are understaffed.
Yeah, of course.
They're
Yeah.
still backlogged from the
And
COVID
I'm not
backlog.
suggesting people shouldn't have due process, but I just think there's something broken if it doesn't really mean anything, you know, in practice. So just something we need to think about.
Yeah, I can tell you we issued just under 3,000 citations, but we haven't collected anything for those yet, for this past year.
The whole year. This
Yeah,
this calendar year.
Yeah, this last
Oh, this
fiscal
last
year.
report year.
Yeah, we issued 2,783
And
citations.
you collected no fines.
If anything, it's very small.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a Seinfeld reservation line here that, you know, it's one thing to take the reservation, but really the whole point is to hold the reservation. You know, the issuing of a citation, you know, doesn't really do much unless, you know, it actually remedies the issue or a fine is, you know, some penalty is accrued. So we'll follow up on that. The last several questions and answers here on enforcement, some of which we've really already talked about, the 6 months that it takes to adjudicate. The others are really focused mostly on internal IT. So I just wanted to ask a question about that. You know, you're working on getting some changes in your technology and the database to be able to collect some of the information that's been requested. Up to this point, it's not really able to be determined. What's the reason to have specific IT in the department versus relying on TEBS to do it? Like, is there a reason for that? Because it seems like that's caused a bit of a challenge here. The department has struggled to fill those spots, and that has held us up from moving forward in a number of ways to build a database that we would need. Makes sense to me. You have been focused on a lot of housing issues. There's been turnover at the department, leadership changes, you know, other things, and you know, this, you know, is not as high of a priority as some of the other issues that were more, you know, urgent needs. But could you just walk me through like why we wouldn't move these needs over? It would seem to me that, you know, let the technology people do the technology stuff and let the housing people do the housing stuff. But maybe I'm missing something.
It's an excellent question, and we've been going through this with TEBS on multiple different levels. I would say the answer is that TEBS is very helpful with running the back end for all of our shared databases across the county. They're also good at coming in and, for example, the county executive's direction, we've been developing a moderately priced dwelling unit portal to facilitate the process for tenants, folks wishing to rent or to buy a moderately priced dwelling unit. And TEBS has, I guess, hopefully by the end of the calendar year, we'll be releasing this. TEBS has developed in cooperation with us the database and the back end, and the front end portal. But then as for day-to-day stuff with troubleshooting things within the department, say with our website, with our existing databases, with pulling data, then often you need someone who is intimately familiar with the full range of what you had. And so whether they set in our building or set in a central location in TEBS, you really do need some folks who are detailed to the department, who will understand the unique, whether it's our department or anybody else's, the unique situation and the different layers of our historic or legacy database systems. And so you really kind of need two levels. We don't necessarily need someone on staff who would develop new databases and new web portals for us. That's a centralized function that can be done. But we do need people who have an intimate knowledge of the variety of systems that we have, and I think any department would need the same.
And on the other hand, we did have dedicated staff who created the code case application. So at the time, they were DHCA employees who developed that app. The people who are there now help to maintain that app. And just like any app, sometimes it crashes. We've gone to go do a major inspection, and there's a glitch in the app, and we have to fix that immediately because we've got 15 inspectors and 15 staff people waiting out to go out and do these inspections, and it can't happen until the app's functioning. So we do have to have somebody that we can reach at a moment's notice to correct those types of situations so that we can keep the train going in the right direction.
Okay, well, expect me to follow up on that one. I'm still not totally convinced that having centralized folks that, let's say, do multiple departments, but have, a specialization, they're not a generalist, but they might, not be day-to-day exclusively just doing DHCA, for instance, would prevent us from having a large number of vacancies that are stopping us from doing critical work. 'Cause, that's essentially what has happened here. There were other priorities in the department, understandably, but the IT folks didn't get hired for, apparently a fairly significant period of time. So, I think we ought to think about that. I think the centralization and decentralization and kind of the picking and choosing of it is a broad, enterprise-wide problem where there doesn't seem to be a particularly strategic rhyme or reason to what are centralized functions and what are department-specific functions, and they tend to kind of go at the whim of an individual department leadership at the time, or a CAO or a county executive at the time, and are kind of done on a one-off basis. And I don't think it's working as well as it could or should. So it's not a DHCA specific concern. It's more of a broader concern, but I do think it's showing up in this particular case. So I think we should really think about that and talk about it. But I'll put a pin in that for the rest of today. I talked about it a little bit during budget. I'll continue to raise it and think about it. But I do think there are things that we should be thinking about doing differently because they're not working as well as we would want them, and we have to rethink the way county government is functioning. And I think we always should be doing that. Director Bruton.
One thing, it's a broader issue than just for IT, but I've been working very cooperatively with the head of Human Resources, the Human Resources Department for the county, to try to speed up all the different phases of our hiring process for when we create positions or refill positions or upgrade a position, to try to minimize the time so that we can replace or hire more quickly. And so it was before my time, so I don't know how much of it was an internal issue on DHCA's part about not filling a position in IT quickly enough. Thankfully we do have the person hired for that position now. Two people for those positions. But that's on me to try to do everything I can in working with other parts of the executive branch to make sure we fill the available funded positions as quickly as we can.
Well, appreciate that. The council had a very robust public conversation on our concerns about vacancies across county government. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges in hiring in general, not necessarily unique exclusively to Montgomery County, but we want to see progress there. So appreciate your continued work. You keep us posted on how that is working. It's something that I think the council will continue to drill in on and focus on, because it is of significant concern. We have to be able to do the people's work, and it's hard to do that when we have 1,500 vacancies in county government. It's not fair to county employees who have to take on colleagues' work because there is no colleague, and it's not fair to the public who rightfully expects that the work is going to get done, their call is going to get answered, their complaint is going to get investigated. And so we need to make sure that we're doing right by our employees and doing right by the public. So appreciate that. Any further comments from colleagues, questions, anything from council staff? All right, well, thank you. There's a lot of follow-up items here, but we've followed up on quite a bit as of today. Obviously, there's more work to be done. The whole purpose of the troubled properties list in this program is to have established a baseline, to know what the problems are, and to get the problems fixed. And so, that is a partnership of the council and the executive. It is hopefully a partnership with property owners, with tenants that we have. We want to work with everybody. We hope that people know where to turn to when there is a problem and knows that we will investigate it. We will follow up on a complaint. And we hope that the overwhelming majority of property owners are going to fix a problem. And when they do, we're going to go back and inspect it very quickly and make sure that we can give them a clean bill, so to speak, and make sure that the residents have a safe and dignified property to live in. So I appreciate your work and your efforts on that. Welcome to our new team members. Thank you to your commitment to a safe community that we all hope to have, and we really appreciate your service to county residents and to county government. So thank you, and let me turn to Councilmember Jawanda before we're adjourned.
I'll just say, hopefully we didn't scare you off, so
Yeah.
we're really happy that you're here, so thank you.
And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for your time and consideration.
Thank you.